Jesus traveled throughout the land of Judea and Galilee. He was a remarkable teacher, sharing profound insights about God's kingdom. Many people were drawn to his words, which offered hope and a new understanding of life. He often taught using simple stories called parables, making complex ideas easier to grasp. Alongside his teaching, Jesus performed many acts of healing. He cared for those who were sick, blind, or suffering in other ways, restoring them to health. His compassion and power were evident to all who encountered him, and his popularity grew rapidly. His teachings were truly powerful and transformative. Jesus spoke of God not as a distant, harsh judge, but as a loving Father who cared deeply for every person. This message was especially good news for the poor, the outcasts, and those who felt forgotten by society. However, his words also presented a significant challenge to the established religious leaders of the time. He talked about a new way to live, one that prioritized love, mercy, and justice over strict adherence to external rules. He aimed to show people what God truly desired from their hearts, which made some who held power feel deeply uncomfortable and increasingly angry. The religious authorities, particularly the groups known as the Pharisees and Sadducees, watched Jesus with growing concern. They observed his increasing influence over the common people and worried that his activities might disrupt the delicate peace with the Roman rulers. They were also troubled by his claims about his own identity and his relationship with God, viewing them as dangerously unorthodox. They interpreted his actions and teachings as a direct threat to their own authority and the traditions they upheld. They began to believe that he was leading people astray and that something needed to be done to stop him. Therefore, these leaders secretly made a plan. They decided that Jesus must be arrested to prevent further unrest or perceived blasphemy. The arrest was carried out quietly, under the cover of darkness, in a garden called Gethsemane, where Jesus often went to pray with his disciples. This sudden and forceful apprehension marked the beginning of a profoundly difficult and unjust ordeal for Jesus. His closest friends, who were with him in the garden, were overcome with fear and scattered. This clandestine arrest set in motion the tragic sequence of events that would ultimately lead him to the Roman cross. After his nighttime arrest, Jesus was immediately taken to the high priest and other prominent religious leaders. They had already gathered, anticipating his arrival, and were prepared to question him through the night. Their primary goal was not to find the truth, but to find a strong and credible reason to formally accuse him of a serious crime. They brought forward various witnesses, but their testimonies were often conflicting or unreliable. They pressed Jesus with many questions about his teachings, his actions, and his claims about his own identity, hoping he would say something they could use against him. Jesus, for the most part, remained calm and often silent, or he gave very careful, measured answers that did not easily fall into their traps. Finally, after much interrogation, the high priest directly asked Jesus if he was the Messiah, the Son of God. When Jesus affirmed this in a way they considered definitive, they accused him of blasphemy. In their understanding, blasphemy was a grave sin. It meant speaking disrespectfully about God or falsely claiming divine attributes or authority. For these leaders, Jesus' assertion that he was God's son, and thus equal with God, was the ultimate act of blasphemy. According to their religious laws, the prescribed penalty for such an offense was death. They felt they had now found the justification they needed to condemn him. However, there was a significant complication for the religious leaders. At that time, Judea was under Roman occupation and governance. While the Jewish council, known as the Sanhedrin, had authority over religious matters and local disputes, they did not possess the legal power to carry out a death sentence. Only the Roman governor held that authority. Therefore, if they wanted Jesus to be executed, they had to bring their charges before the Roman provincial government. This meant taking Jesus to the Roman governor and convincing him that Jesus had committed a crime worthy of death under Roman law, not just Jewish religious law. So Jesus was bound and taken to Pontius Pilate, who was the Roman governor stationed in Judea. Pilate held the ultimate power of life and death in the region. The religious leaders presented their accusations to Pilate, likely emphasizing any claims that could be twisted into acts of rebellion against Rome, such as Jesus being called a king. Pilate listened to their charges and then questioned Jesus himself. After his own examination, Pilate publicly stated that he found no legitimate fault in Jesus, no basis for a capital charge according to Roman legal standards. He seemed to perceive that Jesus was not a political threat, creating a significant dilemma for the governor. The religious leaders, however, were relentless and did not accept Pilate's initial assessment. They vehemently insisted that Jesus was a troublemaker and that he deserved to die according to their laws. They stirred up the crowd that had gathered, creating a volatile atmosphere. They cleverly shifted their accusations, suggesting that Jesus claimed to be a king, which could be interpreted as a challenge to the authority of Caesar, the Roman emperor. Pilate found himself in an increasingly difficult political position. He was responsible for maintaining peace and order in Jerusalem, especially during the sensitive Passover festival, and he feared a riot. He also seemed to recognize that Jesus was likely innocent of any serious Roman crime. Pilate made several attempts to release Jesus, even offering the crowd a choice between releasing Jesus or a known insurrectionist named Barabbas. But the leaders had effectively incited the crowd, who loudly demanded Jesus' crucifixion and Barabbas' release. Faced with mounting pressure and the threat of a public uprising, Pilate ultimately yielded. He ordered Jesus to be scourged and then crucified. In a symbolic gesture intended to absolve himself of responsibility for this decision, Pilate called for a basin of water and washed his hands in front of the crowd, declaring, "I am innocent of this man's blood, see to it yourselves." Following Pilate's order, Jesus was handed over to the Roman soldiers. They subjected him to brutal mockery and physical abuse. They stripped him, placed a scarlet robe on him, pressed a crown woven from thorny branches onto his head, and put a reed in his hand as a mock scepter. After flogging him severely, they made him carry his own heavy wooden cross through the streets of Jerusalem. He was taken to a place outside the city walls called Golgotha, which means the place of the skull. Crucifixion was an excruciatingly painful and humiliating method of execution, reserved by the Romans for the most serious criminals and those who rebelled against their rule. Even as he endured unimaginable suffering on the cross, suspended between two criminals, Jesus displayed extraordinary love and forgiveness. He looked down at the Roman soldiers who had nailed him there and at the people who had called for his death. Instead of cursing them, he prayed to God, his Father, saying words that have echoed through history. "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." In his final hours, he did not succumb to hatred or despair, but continued to embody the message of mercy and compassion that he had taught throughout his ministry. His mother, Mary, and a few loyal friends and disciples watched in profound sorrow from a distance. At the very moment Jesus breathed his last on the cross, a series of extraordinary and unsettling events occurred. The sky, which had been bright earlier, suddenly became profoundly dark, as if a solar eclipse had unexpectedly blotted out the sun in the middle of the afternoon. This darkness lasted for several hours. Simultaneously, the ground began to tremble violently, as if a powerful earthquake was shaking the land. The great curtain in the temple in Jerusalem, a massive veil separating the holiest place, was reported to have torn in two from top to bottom. These dramatic natural phenomena were deeply frightening for those who witnessed them, suggesting this was no ordinary death. A Roman centurion, an experienced military officer in charge of the crucifixion detail, was standing guard near the cross. He had witnessed many executions, but he observed how Jesus conducted himself during his suffering, and how he died. When the centurion saw these things, and felt the earthquake and saw the sudden darkness, he was profoundly moved and filled with awe. He made a remarkable declaration exclaiming, "Truly this man was the Son of God." This spontaneous testimony from a Roman soldier, one of his executioners, highlighted the powerful and undeniable impact of Jesus' final moments on those who were present, regardless of their prior beliefs. For those who had followed Jesus, his death was not just a tragedy, but came to hold immense theological significance. Over time, they understood that his suffering and death were not a meaningless end, but part of God's divine plan. His death was increasingly seen as a profound sacrifice, an atonement for the sins of all humanity. The concept was that sin had created a barrier, a separation between people and a holy God. Jesus' willing death on the cross was believed to be the ultimate price paid to overcome this barrier, mending the broken relationship and opening a new and living way for all people to approach God, to experience forgiveness and reconciliation. The crucifixion of Jesus brought immense grief, despair, and confusion to his disciples and other followers. All their hopes and dreams, which had been so closely tied to him and his teachings about God's approaching kingdom, seemed to have been brutally shattered and buried with him. He had taught them so much about love, performed so many miracles, and shown them the very nature of God's power and compassion. Now he was gone, executed as a criminal. However, this deep sorrow was not destined to be the final chapter of his story. Jesus himself had spoken on several occasions about rising again after 3 days. The question lingered in the heavy air of their grief: how could someone truly come back from the dead? This uncertainty hinted at a miraculous event yet to unfold, the astonishing promise of the resurrection.